All right, so the Spanish-American War is a war, one of the first wars that the U.S. ends up taking place in with global powers, really since the War of 1812. So the Spanish-American War, I want you to definitely know the year that it takes place. It was all within the year of 1898. And the Spanish-American War in 1898 is basically going to be the United States versus Spain, but over Spanish territories. This war is going to take place in Spanish territories. So it all ends up actually starting with Cuba. Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of Florida, was a major trade partner with the United States. America and Cuba had a really strong relationship. Cuba was basically a big tourist destination. Tons of Americans would go to Cuba. It was kind of like America's first Las Vegas. Las Vegas doesn't exist right now at this time, but it was kind of at this point like the party town. In Cuba, prostitution was legal, lots of drugs were legal. People basically went to Cuba to party and to gamble. And so Cuba starts having a lot of American influence, but Cuba is still under the control of Spain. Now, thinking about the Monroe Doctrine that we just reviewed, remember the Monroe Doctrine says that the U.S. will protect the Western Hemisphere from European powers. And so with Cuba, we start to actually see Cuba trying to rebel against the Spanish control. So with the Spanish trying to make sure they hold on to Cuba, because Cuba was definitely a big economic component, as sugar was their main product that they produced. Spain is trying to keep Cuba and control Cuba, while Cuba is trying to have a revolution. Now, this revolution, the U.S. definitely, again, thinking, I know it's hypocritical at this point, but the U.S., the fact that the U.S. actually was created because of a revolution over European power, the U.S. feels like they should basically help. And so as the Cuban rebels are definitely trying to gain independence from Spain, this rebellion is taking years to actually achieve. It's not a success for Cuba, and Cuba basically is under this control of the Spanish that starts to get published and actually seeing and realizing the horrible treatment that Spain is now imposing on Cuba. For example, Cuba ends up basically having these issues of what we would call today concentration camps. Spain ended up sending in a military general. His name was General Weyler, Weyler. And General Weyler basically started forcing rebels into these concentration camps where people, thousands of Cubans, were starving. And we ended up actually getting pictures of the people in these concentration camps. And the US and Cubans started to call General Weyler the butcher. And these pictures and General Weyler's reputation was being definitely published throughout American newspapers. Now, with American newspapers, basically the US ended up taking these images and publishing them for the US to see. And during this time, we ended up actually calling this publishment yellow journalism. Now, with yellow journalism, basically, yellow journalism is just very, very sensationalized newspaper articles. We ended up seeing a competition between these two newspaper editors, Joseph Pulitzer, which you may recognize like the Pulitzer Prize, and William Randolph Hearst. Basically, they both owned a newspaper, and the goal was to sell more newspapers than the other. And the way you sell more newspapers is to have these crazy, extravagant headlines that cause people to pick them up. If you've seen or heard the musical Newsies, this is totally this time period where the headline was the most important part of selling the newspaper. So Hearst, one of his famous quotes was, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. You give me images and I'll make up these stories and sensationalize these stories that cause people to now care." And it's interesting because the media definitely is what causes people to care. The media publishes certain things, and if we aren't aware of what's happening, we don't have any idea or any care of what the issues that are going on. So, without the media bringing our attention to issues, we would have no idea what actually was happening in the world. So Hearst and Pulitzer were both publishing very extravagant stories about the concentration camps, and it's causing more people, more Americans to say, hey, we need to go in and help Cuba. We need to stop this Spanish rule over this country and help Cuba because of these stories that were being told to the public. So while yellow journalism is kind of a backbone to the Spanish American War, it's kind of like a lead up. I would definitely say like a gradual cause to the Spanish American War. There are two major reasons that we end up having the Spanish American War declared. The first one is the De Lome letter, which De Lome was a Spanish ambassador in the United States. And De Lome, as the Spanish ambassador, wrote a letter back home to Spain that ended up being intercepted or ended up getting leaked. And basically, this letter, De Lome totally criticizes the U.S. President McKinley. In this letter, he says that McKinley is weak, that McKinley isn't going to do anything with Cuba, that McKinley basically doesn't have the guts to stand up to Spain. Now, when the U.S. criticizes their own president, it seems to get away with it because the U.S. definitely with freedom of speech and freedom of press. But when a foreign ambassador basically criticized the president, a lot of Americans felt that this was disrespectful. And I mean, people in the US criticize McKinley for being weak. Even his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt said that McKinley had a weaker backbone than an eclair. And yes, I know the smack talking back then was pretty lame. But the fact that even the vice president of the U.S. said McKinley was weak, it definitely shows, De Lome probably wasn't wrong, but it definitely offended a lot of Americans. Now, the event that really caused the U.S. to get into the war was the explosion of the USS Maine. The USS Maine, a naval ship that is part of the U.S. Navy, was in Cuba. It was anchored in the Havana harbor. Basically, we had the USS Maine there for precaution in case something happened or in case Cuba had issues and there had to be evacuations or so forth. The USS Maine was there for protection and for precaution. So the USS Maine randomly one night just sunk. It exploded off the Havana harbor. And this explosion, obviously, everyone assumed that Spain blew up the USS Maine. And with that explosion, immediately there became a huge push to declare war on Spain. So jingoism is this mentality. Basically, jingoism is a very aggressive foreign policy. This push for nationalism, this push to defend our country. And with jingoism and with the USS Maine, we saw a major push to go to war and declare war on Spain. So right after the USS Maine exploded, U.S. Congress declared war on Spain, and we now are at war with a major European power. Now, a little interesting fact, hindsight, we ended up actually pulling the USS Maine out of the Havana harbor, did a little bit of research on it, and found out that actually there was an engine failure that caused the explosion, but we ended up kind of keeping that hush hush for a while and not letting the public know because we were actually already at war with Spain. And it became kind of the big rally cry for this war. One of the biggest rally cries was remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. And this war ended up lasting for a very short 4 months. So, with declaring war, we ended up having Congress declare war in April of 1898. And this war is only going to last for about 4 months. Now, when declaring this war, we ended up also passing with the declaration the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment basically said that the U.S. has no intention